The morning sun over Nevada burned bright and unrelenting, washing the Air Force Base in gold and dust. The desert always looked the same, flat, fierce, and endless. For most people, it was a miserable place to live. But for Charlie Squadron, it was home. Inside Hangar 9, laughter bounced off metal walls like music. The air smelled of jet fuel, sweat, and instant coffee. A half-disassembled F-16 sat in the middle, and around it, 5 men argued loudly about who was the worst pilot in the squadron. "Come on, Diaz," said Staff Sergeant Miller, the loudest of them all. "You couldn't land a paper plane without breaking the landing gear." "Yeah?" Diaz shot back, smirking. "At least I don't scream every time a bird crosses my windshield." The others burst into laughter. Someone threw a greasy rag. Someone else turned up the radio. Between the roar of laughter and the hum of tools, discipline had no place here. Charlie Squadron was the pride and headache of the base, top performers in missions, nightmare in manners. They worked hard, played harder, and obeyed orders only when convenient. Their commander, Colonel Jacobs, had long since given up trying to straighten them out. "As long as they bring the birds home," he often said, "let the boys laugh." But now, Jacobs was retiring. After 22 years, he wanted peace, fishing, and his grandkids, not 6 grown men who treated the Air Force like a college dorm. That morning, during coffee break, the squad gathered around the old vending machine, mugs in hand, buzzing with gossip. "So, who's the unlucky soul replacing Jacobs?" asked Corporal Diaz, popping a piece of gum. Miller shrugged. "Some transfer from D.C., I heard. Probably another desk pilot. We'll break him in by the end of the week." A mechanic across the room chuckled. "Not him, Miller, her." The entire group froze. "What?" "Yeah," said the mechanic. "Rumor is it's a woman. High rank. Air Force Academy graduate. Real tight on rules." For a moment, silence hovered. Then the hangar erupted in laughter. "A woman? Commanding us?" Miller barked, doubling over. "What's next? Pink flight suits and scented jet fuel?" Diaz laughed so hard, he nearly dropped his coffee. Imagine her trying to handle Miller's mouth for a day. "Or Diaz's hygiene," someone else added, and the hangar howled again. They joked for hours. The idea of a female commanding officer leading their wild squadron felt ridiculous, almost comical. In their minds, she'd last a week before asking for reassignment. By noon, the rumors had spread across the base. The younger soldiers made bets. 2 weeks before she quits, 10 days before she cries, 5 before she yells. It became the talk of every lunch table. But amid the laughter, Master Sergeant Lewis, the oldest in the unit, stayed silent. He'd been around long enough to know that laughter usually meant fear in disguise. "You boys keep laughing," Lewis finally said, sipping his coffee. "But remember, the Air Force doesn't send just anyone to command Charlie Squadron." Miller smirked. "You saying she's gonna scare us straight, old man?" Lewis looked at him over the rim of his mug. "I'm saying, if DC sent her here, she's not coming to make friends. She's coming to fix a problem. And that problem might just be us." The laughter died down, but only for a moment. The following week dragged slowly. The men carried on their routine, fixing planes, running drills, and cracking jokes. Yet beneath the humor, there was tension, curiosity, even a bit of unease. Rumors changed daily. Some said she'd been a pilot. Others claimed she worked with Pentagon intelligence. One rumor even said she was married to a general. No one knew the truth, but everyone had an opinion. Miller, as usual, made the most noise. "She'll probably walk in quoting the rulebook," he said one evening, lounging on a crate. "Then faint when she sees what a real squadron looks like." Diaz chuckled. We should get her a welcome gift, maybe a pink clipboard. Laughter again. Loud, confident, cocky. But deep down, some part of them wondered if they were underestimating her. The day she arrived began like any other. The desert wind howled across the tarmac, rattling the hangar doors. The squad was in the middle of maintenance checks when a call came over the intercom. Charlie's squadron. Report to Hangar 9. New commanding officer arriving at 0900 hours. Miller wiped his hands on a rag. Here we go, boys. Showtime. They lined up, half serious, half amused. Shirts half tucked, boots dusty, one man chewing gum. It was more of a casual greeting than a military formation. At exactly 0900, the heavy doors opened, and the laughter stopped. She walked in, LT. Colonel Rebecca Hayes. There was no fanfare, no escort, no dramatic music, just quiet authority. Her uniform looked like it had been pressed with a ruler. Her dark hair was pulled tight into a regulation bun. Her gaze, sharp and steady, swept across the room with clinical precision. Gentlemen, she said calmly, voice firm enough to silence the base generator's hum. Good morning. No one replied. Miller shifted uncomfortably. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, she continued. Effective immediately, I am your new commanding officer. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight, like steel wrapped in velvet. She let the silence linger, watching them. Then she added, I understand Charlie Squadron has a reputation. A few smirks appeared. She noticed every one. Let me make something clear, she said, stepping forward until she stood a few feet from Miller, the self-appointed alpha of a group. You can call me ma'am or colonel. Not miss, not Commander Barbie, and definitely not whatever else you've been whispering since I got off the plane. Every muscle in the room tightened. She gave a faint, knowing smile. Good. Then we understand each other. For the first time, no one had a comeback. Over the next hour, she inspected the hangar, noting everything from tool placement to safety markings. Her questions were sharp, but fair. She spoke with the mechanics, the logistics team, even the junior airmen. Direct, professional, efficient. When she finally dismissed them, Miller exhaled loudly. Well, that was something, Diaz muttered. She didn't even blink. Yeah, Miller replied, rubbing the back of his neck. And did you notice she didn't smile once? She didn't need to, Lewis said quietly from behind them. That woman owns the room the second she walks in. Miller tried to laugh, but it came out forced. Something had shifted in the air. Something subtle but undeniable. For the first time in a long while, Charlie's squadron wasn't laughing out of confidence. They were laughing out of nerves. That night, the hangar was unusually quiet. No music, no shouting, no crude jokes. The men sat around the break table, unusually reflective. Miller finally spoke. You think she'll last? Lewis leaned back. No question. Why's that? Because she didn't come here to last, Miller. She came here to lead. The others exchanged glances. Outside, the desert wind blew softly, carrying the faint hum of jet engines into the night sky. Somewhere on base, Rebecca Hayes reviewed her files. Mission reports, maintenance logs, personnel evaluations. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes burned with quiet purpose. Tomorrow, she would begin her mission. Not to fight a foreign enemy, but to rebuild a broken squadron. And when she did, Charlie's squadron would finally understand why the laughter had stopped. The next morning, the desert sky was a sheet of pale gold, and the air already carried the promise of heat. In Hangar 9, Charlie's squadron stood at half attention, restless and uneasy. The previous day's introduction had left the men unsettled, their usual laughter replaced with whispers. Miller adjusted his cap for the 5th time. She's probably late, he muttered, checking his watch. Figures. Not likely, Lewis replied without looking up. She doesn't strike me as the late type. Miller smirked. What, you are fan club president now? Lewis said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the door. At precisely 0700, it opened. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes entered, the same quiet authority in every step. She carried no folder, no notes, no coffee. Just herself. The sound of her boots echoed sharply, like punctuation marks in a sentence no one dared to finish. She stopped in front of them. Good morning, gentlemen. The squad replied out of instinct, though unevenly. Miller's tone was lazy, Diaz's almost mocking. Rebecca didn't flinch. You'll address me in unison, with clarity and respect, she said, her voice level. Let's try again. Good morning, ma'am. Better. She nodded. That's a start. Her gaze swept across the hangar, pausing briefly on every face, like a scanner recording details. She noticed the oil stains on boots, the missing patches on uniforms, the smirk still lingering on Diaz's mouth. Nothing escaped her. I've reviewed your performance records, she began. Excellent mission success rate. Above average efficiency. And below average discipline. A faint chuckle escaped Miller before he could stop himself. Rebecca turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto him. Something funny, Sergeant? He straightened. No, ma'am. Good, she said, tilting her head. Because I'd hate to think your sense of humor is stronger than your respect for command. The silence that followed was so sharp you could hear a wrench drop 3 hangars away. She continued, I don't care what your reputation is. I don't care what you did under Colonel Jacobs. I'm not him. I don't run this squadron by laughter or luck. I run it by precision, by pride, and by performance that keeps every one of you alive when things go wrong. Her tone wasn't angry. It was colder than anger, controlled, deliberate, impossible to argue with. For the first time, the men didn't look at her like an intruder. They looked at her like a problem they didn't know how to solve. After the assembly, she didn't retreat to her office. She stayed. She walked the hangar floor, observing every task, the refueling checks, the weapon calibrations, the maintenance logs. She didn't interfere, but she took notes, mental ones. Every detail mattered. Diaz, trying to break the tension, whistled quietly while tightening a bolt. Without looking up, she said, Armand Diaz, if you have enough breath to whistle, you're not working hard enough. The whistle stopped mid-note. A few men exchanged glances. She hadn't raised her voice once. And yet, somehow, she'd managed to command more control in 10 words than Jacobs had in 10 years. Still, not everyone was ready to bow to her authority. Miller, the squad's unofficial leader, decided to test her. At lunch, when the team assembled in the break room, he deliberately arrived 10 minutes late to the debrief. Coffee in one hand, smirk on his face, he strolled in like nothing happened. Glad you could join us, Sergeant, Rebecca said without looking up from her notes. Traffic was rough, ma'am, Miller said casually. Tough to get across that long hallway. A couple of muffled laughs echoed behind him. Rebecca closed her notebook slowly, her expression unreadable. You're right, Sergeant. Long walk. She paused, then added, Since you had trouble with timing, I'll help you improve it. From tomorrow onward, you'll report 15 minutes early for every briefing. For the next 2 weeks. Miller's smirk faltered. Ma'am, that's not regulation. No, she replied, meeting his eyes. It's leadership. Then she turned back to her notes, effectively ending the conversation. The men stared. No shouting. No punishment report. Just calm, surgical correction. It was unnerving, almost impressive. That night, Miller sat on the barracks steps, staring at the desert horizon. Lewis joined him quietly. She's serious, Miller muttered. Of course she's serious, Lewis said. You think DC sends jokers to clean up squads like ours? Miller sighed. She's good. I'll give her that. But she's got no idea what this place is like. We survive by laughing, not saluting every 5 seconds. Lewis chuckled. Maybe. Or maybe we've been laughing to hide the fact that we stopped caring about the rules a long time ago. Miller didn't answer. Somewhere deep inside, he knew Lewis was right. The next morning came early. The squad lined up before dawn for a surprise inspection. Rebecca walked down the line, checking every uniform, every patch, every bootlace. Sergeant Miller, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked at his chest. Your nameplate's crooked. He glanced down, barely off by a fraction. Fix it, she said. Yes, ma'am. He did. She moved on to Diaz. Your patch is torn. Yes, ma'am. Replace it. Yes, ma'am. She reached Lewis and stopped. His uniform was perfect. His salute sharp. She nodded. Good work, Master Sergeant. Lewis replied simply, Just doing my job now. She gave a small approving nod and moved on. After the inspection, she gathered them. This isn't punishment. This is preparation. You're one emergency away from chaos. If you can't respect the basics here, you'll fail out there. And failure in this business, she said, tapping her finger on her chest, means funerals. Not excuses. Her words landed heavy. Not angry, not loud, just real. Later that day, she took command of her first flight simulation. The mission was simple. Simulate an airstrike coordination. Exercise with timed communication between the hangar and flight team. It fell apart in 5 minutes. Missed signals, sloppy coordination, and delayed responses. Everything went wrong. When it was over, the men braced for a verbal explosion. But Rebecca didn't yell. She stood in silence, arms crossed, looking at the monitor. The tension was unbearable. Then she turned to the team. Tell me what went wrong. Miller frowned. We messed up the timing, ma'am. Why? Communication breakdown? Why? He hesitated. Because no one was listening, she said quietly. You were too used to doing it your way. Not the right way. That ends now. She dismissed them without another word. By evening, the squadron was restless. The mood in the mess hall was heavy. Not anger, not rebellion, just uncertainty. She's not like the others, Diaz said quietly. Lewis nodded. No, she's better. Miller poked at his food. She's cold. Like a machine. Machines don't care if you live or die, Lewis said. She does. You can see it. You're just too proud to admit it. Miller didn't reply. He remembered her face when she talked about funerals. There had been something in her tone, a hint of pain, buried deep under control. He didn't know her story yet, but he could tell she'd seen things that changed her. That night, as the base lights dimmed, Rebecca sat alone in her office. The room was bare except for her desk, a metal filing cabinet, and a single photo. 2 Air Force pilots standing beside a fighter jet, smiling under a bright Afghan sun. Her hand brushed the photo frame lightly before she placed it face down. The laughter echoing faintly from the barracks outside reminded her of another squadron, another time, one that hadn't survived. She opened her logbook and wrote her first entry as commander of Charlie Squadron. A1. Discipline absent. Potential high. Resistance moderate. Mission. Rebuild trust, then unity. She paused, pen hovering above the page, then added, They laugh to hide fear. I've seen it before. She closed the notebook. Outside, the night grew quiet, almost respectful. And as the desert wind swept over the base, the laughter faded once more, replaced by something deeper, something that sounded a lot like change. 3 weeks had passed since Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes took command of Charlie's squadron, and the hangar no longer sounded like a playground. The loud music had vanished. The off-color jokes that once bounced off the metal walls were now replaced by the rhythmic buzz of drills and clanking tools. Still, silence didn't mean respect. It meant resentment. Behind every "yes, ma'am," there was an eye roll. Behind every completed task, a muttered complaint. They obeyed her, but only because they had to. Rebecca knew it, and she didn't mind. Respect earned too quickly, she'd learned, never lasted. Her daily routine was surgical in its precision. At 0500, she was already in the hangar reviewing flight readiness logs. By 0600, she led inspection rounds. By 0700, the squad was running drills under her sharp gaze. She spoke little, but every instruction carried weight. Her calm unnerved them more than shouting ever could. "She's like a robot," Diaz muttered one morning, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No emotions. No breaks." Lewis replied without looking up. "She's not a robot. She's a professional. You might try it sometime." Diaz grunted but said nothing. That afternoon, the squadron had a maintenance exercise, simulated repair of a jet's hydraulic system under time pressure. It was a standard test, something they'd done dozens of times. But Rebecca watched closely, noting their coordination, or lack of it. Miller led the team. He was fast, confident, and just sloppy enough to be dangerous. "Time check, 5 minutes left," Rebecca called out. Miller tightened the last bolt, sweat dripping from his temple. "Done," he said, stepping back proudly. Rebecca didn't move. She just crouched near the engine, eyes scanning the components. Then she reached out and twisted a loose nut with her fingers. The faint metallic click echoed like a gunshot. "Done?" she repeated quietly. Miller froze. It must have isn't an answer, Sergeant," she interrupted, standing straight. "In the field, that mistake doesn't mean a redo. It means someone dies." Her tone was even, but the silence afterward burned hotter than the desert air. She turned to the rest. "Reset. Start over." Miller's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, it was a small error." "We can start over." For a moment, he hesitated. Then, grudgingly, he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The team began again, slower this time, quieter. The laughter that once fueled them was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar: focus. Later that day, Rebecca sat alone in her small office, writing her observations. Her handwriting was neat, efficient, each line precise. Miller, skilled, overconfident, leads by ego, not example. Diaz, capable but immature. Lewis, disciplined. Possible ally. Squadron overall, fractured unity. Needs purpose, not punishment. She sighed and leaned back. Leadership wasn't just about barking orders. It was about reshaping habits, one choice at a time. Her eyes drifted to the photo frame she kept turned down. She didn't touch it, but her expression softened briefly before the mask of discipline returned. By evening, frustration had begun to simmer among the men. In the mess hall, the mood was restless. Miller sat at the table with Diaz, Lewis, and 2 others. "I swear, she's trying to break us," Miller said, stabbing his fork into his food. "Every day it's something new. Inspections, drills, lectures. We're not recruits, for God's sake." Diaz nodded. "Feels like she's punishing us just for breathing." Lewis stayed quiet. Miller leaned forward. "You've been quiet lately, old man. You don't agree?" Lewis met his eyes. "She's not punishing you, Miller. She's testing you. Big difference. Testing us for what? To see if we're worth leading. That silenced the table. After a long moment, Miller scoffed. She's still just another officer trying to prove she's tougher than the boys. Lewis sighed. Keep thinking that. You'll find out soon enough what she's really trying to prove. 2 days later, the clash came. It started small, as it always did. During an afternoon briefing, Rebecca outlined a revised flight protocol, stricter checklists, added safety redundancies, and a mandatory 10-minute cross-verification after each pre-flight inspection. Miller raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, this is unnecessary. We already hit readiness targets. Rebecca didn't look up from her tablet. And yet, this squadron has logged more maintenance violations than any other unit on base. Minor infractions, Miller shot back. No one's ever been hurt. Rebecca's eyes lifted, steady and sharp. Yet, he held her gaze. The room was still. Ma'am, he said finally, his tone clipped. We're professionals. We don't need babysitting. Rebecca's jaw tensed slightly, the first visible crack in her calm. Then she spoke, voice lower than before. You're right, Sergeant. You don't need babysitting. You need accountability. There's a difference. She stepped closer, close enough that Miller could see the small scar near her temple, a remnant of something she'd lived through, not just read about. In combat, she said, I watched 2 pilots die because someone thought a checklist was optional. You think I'm strict? You have no idea what failure feels like until you see your teammate's name etched on a memorial wall. The room fell completely silent. No one dared move. Then, as if to remind them she wasn't angry, just firm, she turned and walked away. Meeting dismissed. That night, Miller couldn't sleep. Her words replayed in his mind, looping like static. You have no idea what failure feels like. He tried brushing it off, but something in her tone, that restrained pain, wouldn't leave his head. He'd lost friends before, sure, but not like that. Not under his watch. The next morning, he was the first in the hangar, early, silent, focused. When Rebecca entered, she gave no acknowledgement, but her eyes flicked briefly in his direction, noticing, recording. It wasn't a victory, but it was a beginning. The transformation was slow, almost invisible. Over the next week, Miller's attitude shifted. His jokes faded. His posture straightened. The others noticed, but said nothing. One afternoon, Diaz approached him. You going soft on us, Miller? Miller shrugged. Just tired of giving her more reasons to prove we're idiots. Diaz smirked. That's a first. But when the next drill came, Diaz found himself mirroring Miller's focus. It spread quietly, like a virus, not of fear, but of respect. Rebecca didn't comment, though she saw it all. When the squad completed their next maintenance drill flawlessly, every bolt checked, every log signed, she simply said, acceptable improvement. And somehow, that felt like a medal. A week later, another challenge came, unplanned this time. During a standard test run, one of the jet's hydraulic lines burst mid-engine check, spraying fluid across the hangar floor. Chaos erupted, shouting, alarms, confusion. Before anyone could panic, Rebecca's voice cut through the noise. Shut the engine down. Secure the area. Her commands were sharp, calm, immediate. Within seconds, order replaced chaos. Miller jumped in to assist, directing the team with precision. Together, they sealed the leak and contained the spill. When it was over, Rebecca surveyed the scene. No injuries. No damage. No panic. She gave a small nod. That, she said quietly, is how professionals react. For the first time, a few of the men smiled, not out of arrogance, but pride. Later that night, in the barracks, Diaz turned to Miller. You know something weird? What? I think. I actually like her. Miller chuckled softly. Yeah, me too. Lewis, half asleep in the bunk above them, murmured, Told you boys. She's not here to break you. She's here to make you better. The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that comes after realization. Outside, the desert wind howled softly against the windows. The base lights flickered, glowing faintly in the darkness. In her office, Rebecca wrote her daily note. Progress visible. Resistance decreasing. Still miles to go. Then she paused, pen hovering, before adding, They're learning faster than they know. She closed the notebook, stood by the window, and watched the stars glitter over the vast desert sky. Change was slow, but it had begun. And for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. The desert had a way of stripping people down, not just their bodies, but their pride. The heat burned away pretense during the day, and the cold at night carved through arrogance like glass. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes understood that perfectly, which was why, one Friday evening, she called for a readiness evaluation, an unannounced midnight drill. When the loudspeakers crackled to life at 2,300 hours, the entire base groaned. All Charlie Squadron personnel, report to the flight deck immediately. Full gear. Repeat, full gear. Miller, half asleep, sat up instantly. You've got to be kidding me. Diaz grumbled from the bunk below. We're not even on alert rotation. What the hell for? Lewis didn't move fast enough. His tone was resigned. Orders are orders, move. Within 15 minutes, the squad stood in formation. Eyes red, boots dusty, breath visible in the cold night air. The hangar lights blazed like daylight against the sand. Rebecca stood before them, uniform crisp as if she'd never gone to sleep. Gentlemen, she began calmly, tonight we're going to find out how ready this squadron really is. Miller shifted, jaw tightening. He'd known something like this was coming, but not tonight. Not after a 14-hour shift. Rebecca continued, This exercise will simulate a complete systems failure in the field. You'll retrieve critical supplies, perform emergency maintenance on a grounded aircraft, and secure the perimeter without power, communication, or assistance. You have 2 hours. Diaz blinked. Ma'am, in the middle of the desert? At night? Her eyes cut toward him. Would the enemy wait for daylight, Sergeant? He swallowed. No, ma'am. Good. Then neither will we. By 2330, they were loaded into 2 Humvees, headlights off, driving into the endless stretch of sand. The moonlight painted the dunes silver. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of tires and the soft hum of engines. After 20 minutes, Rebecca raised a hand. Stop here. The vehicles halted. The squad piled out, the cold air slicing through their uniforms. She pointed toward a distant ridge, its outline barely visible in the dark. Your target is half a mile northeast. The downed aircraft's beacon will activate once I give the signal. You'll locate it, assess the situation, and execute a full field repair under blackout conditions. Miller frowned. Ma'am, without comms or lighting, that'll take as long as it takes, she said evenly. You're professionals. Prove it. Then she handed him a small, sealed case. Your supplies. Treat it like gold. Without another word, she stepped back, radioed a brief command, and the Humvees rolled away, leaving them alone in the desert. The squad began their trek, trudging through shifting sand that swallowed every step. The temperature dropped fast, and the cold gnawed through their gloves. Diaz muttered, She's insane. Miller shot him a glare. Save it. You'll need that breath to move. Lewis was quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. You hear that? A faint beeping, distant, rhythmic, floated through the wind. There, Miller said. That's our bird. They picked up pace. After 10 grueling minutes, a silhouette of the down-training jet came into view, half buried in sand, beacon flashing weakly. Miller knelt beside the fuselage, flashlight covered with his hand to preserve night vision. Hydraulic failure simulation. We've got to replace the line and reboot the system manually. Let's do it, Lewis said. They got to work. Tools clinked. Breath fogged the air. The men moved with practiced rhythm, but the exhaustion was starting to bite. Halfway through, Diaz dropped a wrench, the sound echoing like thunder in the stillness. Watch it, Miller hissed. Sorry, fingers are numb. Rebecca's voice, faint but distinct, crackled through their earpieces. One-way transmission only. Every sound travels in silence. Discipline isn't just about following orders. It's about awareness. Diaz winced. She's watching us? Miller smirked slightly. She's always watching us. Time dragged. The cold was merciless. Sand crept into their boots and gloves. Finally, after what felt like hours, Miller tightened the last fitting. Done. Lewis checked the gauge. Pressure's stable. Systems live. Before they could breathe a sigh of relief, a sudden gust of wind howled over the ridge, blowing sand into their faces. Then, darkness. The beacon went dead. What the? Diaz shouted. Miller tapped the panel. Power failure? Lewis shook his head. No, that's not part of the simulation. A flare burst overhead, red. Rebecca's voice came through again, calm but sharp. New scenario. Enemy interference. Evac protocol in effect. Secure your perimeter and await extraction. Diaz cursed under his breath. You've got to be kidding. Shut it, Miller barked. Positions now. They spread out, forming a defensive semicircle around the jet, scanning the horizon. Every rustle of wind sounded like footsteps. Minutes crawled by. No movement. No sound but the wind. Then headlights. 2 vehicles approaching fast. Are those ours? Lewis whispered. Miller squinted. No ID lights. Stay down. The engines roared closer, and then just before they reached them, the lights shut off. Silence. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then a voice echoed through the dark. Nice formation, gentlemen. Rebecca stepped into the moonlight, her face illuminated by the faint silver glow. The vehicles behind her came to a halt. Miller exhaled hard. You're kidding me. She didn't smile. You lasted 47 minutes before assuming enemy contact. Not bad. But next time, you confirm before you freeze. Diaz looked ready to collapse. Ma'am, permission to speak freely? Granted. Pat was insane. Rebecca folded her arms. So is combat, Sergeant. When they returned to base at 0300, the men were too exhausted to speak. Their uniforms were coated in dust, faces streaked with sweat and sand. Rebecca walked beside them, silent, her pace steady. In the hangar, she dismissed them with a simple, debrief at 0900. Get some rest. Miller lingered as the others filed out. Ma'am, he said quietly, was all that really necessary? Rebecca looked at him. Did you learn something? He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, we're not as ready as we thought. Then it was necessary. At the debrief later that morning, she stood before a projector displaying timestamps, data logs, and footage from drone cameras that had tracked their every move. She analyzed their choices like a surgeon, efficient, unemotional. But when the footage showed Diaz dropping the wrench, she paused. Then she said something unexpected. Sergeant Diaz, that moment, the drop tool, it's human. Mistakes happen. What matters is how fast you recover. You didn't freeze. You moved. That's what counts. Diaz blinked. For the first time, Her words didn't sound like criticism. She continued, turning to the rest. Last night wasn't about failure. It was about finding the cracks before they break under pressure. Then her voice softened, just barely. You didn't quit. That's more than I can say for most squads I've led. The room was still. Miller caught himself before speaking, but she noticed the flicker of pride in his eyes. Dismissed, she said finally. Later, as the squad walked out, Diaz nudged Miller. You realize what just happened? What? She praised us. Miller grinned faintly. Don't get used to it. But deep down, even he couldn't deny the shift. Something had changed. The air between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was charged with determination. That evening, Rebecca sat alone in her office, the desert wind rattling the blinds. She opened her notebook and wrote, Phase 1 complete. They broke, but not apart. Her pen hovered. Then she added, Next, we rebuild. She closed the book, leaned back, and for the first time in weeks, allowed herself to feel the quiet satisfaction of progress hard won. Out on the runway, the squad was already working overtime, voluntarily. And in the distance, for the first time since she arrived, a faint sound drifted through the hangar. Not laughter, but something close. The sound of men who finally believed they were becoming the team she saw in them all along. The morning began like any other, sun glaring off the tarmac, engines humming in the distance, the faint scent of jet fuel thick in the air. Charlie's squadron moved with a precision that would have been unthinkable just a month earlier. No one dragged their feet. No one cracked jokes during prep. Rebecca Hayes watched from the catwalk above the hangar, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. What she saw below wasn't perfection, not yet, but it was discipline. Progress. She allowed herself the smallest nod of approval. Today's assignment was routine. Assist in a multi-squadron training exercise, airlifting supplies to a remote desert testing range. Nothing complex. But Rebecca had learned to distrust routine. Routine was when complacency struck hardest. By 0900, the aircraft were fueled and ready. The squad gathered for final briefing. Rebecca stood at the head of the table, maps and wind charts spread before her. We'll depart in formation at 0930, altitude 15,000 feet. Expected flight time, 55 minutes. Keep radio chatter minimal. Maintain vector protocol at all times. She paused, scanning their faces. Any questions? Miller raised a hand. Ma'am, the weather report shows some instability over Sector 4. High winds, possible microbursts. Rebecca nodded. I've seen the data. It's within safe parameters. But good catch, Sergeant. We'll stay alert. Then she added, voice firm. Remember, your training doesn't stop once we leave the ground. It begins. The men nodded, serious. Outside, the engines roared to life. The takeoff was smooth, almost peaceful. Blue sky stretched endlessly above them, the desert below like a sleeping giant. Inside the aircraft, Miller ran diagnostics, Diaz monitored communications, and Lewis coordinated flight data. Everything hummed in perfect rhythm. Feels too easy, Diaz muttered. Miller cracked a grin. Don't jinx it. Rebecca, seated at the cockpit's secondary console, didn't look up. He already did. 30 minutes into the flight, the first warning light blinked on. Lewis frowned. Ma'am, we're picking up atmospheric instability ahead. Barometric pressures dropping fast. Rebecca leaned forward. Visual confirmation? Negative clear sky. The aircraft jolted slightly. Then again, harder. Diaz grabbed the overhead handle. What the hell? A sharp metallic crack echoed from below. Hydraulic warning. Rebecca's voice cut through the chaos. Hydraulic failure on line 2. Miller switched to backup pressure system. Diaz reduced throttle to 80%. They moved in sync. Calm, focused, but the next jolt nearly threw them sideways. Alarms blared. Backup systems not responding. Miller shouted. Altitude dropping to 13,000 and falling fast. Lewis yelled. Rebecca's tone didn't waver. Engage emergency bypass. Now. Miller pulled the lever, nothing. For a heartbeat, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Rebecca stood, gripped the railing, and shouted over the alarms. Everyone brace. Manual override. She climbed forward, grabbed the auxiliary lever beside the pilot's seat, and yanked hard. The sound was deafening, a metallic shriek as the valves repressurized. The plane lurched, steadied for a second, and then dropped again. Ma'am, we're still losing altitude. I know, she snapped. Redistribute power to the right engine. Trim the flaps. 20 degrees. The aircraft shuddered violently, but this time it responded. Slowly, painfully, the nose lifted. Altitude, 11,500 feet. 12,000. Stable. Rebecca exhaled, steadying herself. Status report. Miller wiped sweat from his brow. Hydraulic line 2 completely shot. We're flying on backup manual control. Shouldn't even be possible. Yet here we are, she said. Diaz chuckled nervously. Remind me never to doubt your crazy drills again. Rebecca didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed ahead, on the horizon where storm clouds had begun to form. By the time they neared the drop zone, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple. Winds buffeted the aircraft, jerking it off course. Lewis cursed softly. Wind shears increasing. We're drifting 10 degrees off vector. Compensate manually, Rebecca said. He adjusted, but the turbulence only grew worse. Suddenly, lightning flashed ahead, close. Too close. Diaz flinched. That's not in the forecast. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Weather changes faster than forecasts. Focus. A deafening boom cracked through the sky. The plane rocked hard, alarm screaming again. Engine 2 hit. Power loss on the right side. Miller yelled. Rebecca didn't hesitate. Feather the prop. Don't fight the drag. We ride it out. They descended fast, every second stretching into eternity. Altitude 9,087. Level us out, Miller. I'm trying. Rebecca reached forward, grabbed the yoke beside him, and together they steadied it. The wings leveled, the screaming wind softened slightly. Silence returned, tense, heavy, but alive. The storm raged outside, but the team inside had found something stronger than fear. Unity. After 10 brutal minutes, they broke through the storm's edge. The clouds parted, revealing a strip of desert below, flat and hard enough for an emergency landing. Rebecca glanced at Miller. You're up. Ends. He nodded. Copy that. The aircraft dropped steadily, skimming the dunes. Sand whipped across the windshield like shrapnel. 200 feet. 100. 50. Impact. The plane bounced once, twice, then screeched to a halt in a shower of sand and metal. The cabin filled with silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Diaz started laughing, half shock, half relief. We're alive, he gasped. We're actually alive. Lewis slumped back in his seat. Remind me to update my will anyway. Rebecca didn't laugh. She unbuckled, checked the cabin for damage, and finally looked at her men. You did well, she said simply. Now let's see if we can get this thing off the ground again. It took 2 hours to stabilize the aircraft, patch the line, and transmit an emergency signal. The sun was setting by the time a recovery team arrived. When they finally returned to base, the squad was silent, not out of fear, but awe. The base commander met them on the tarmac. "Heard you had a rough flight, Colonel." Rebecca nodded. "Training paid off." He smiled faintly. "Word is, your squad handled it like veterans. Even Miller." Rebecca's lips curved just enough to suggest a smile. "Especially Miller." Later that night, in the mess hall, the squad sat together. For once, no one complained. Miller raised his glass of water. "To survival." Diaz snorted. "To Hayes, you mean?" "She saved our asses." Lewis nodded. "And somehow made us save them with her." Rebecca passed by just then, overhearing them. Without breaking stride, she said, "I'll drink to that, when you stop calling me her and start saying RCO." The men grinned. "Yes, ma'am." At midnight, Rebecca stood on the runway alone. The stars stretched endlessly above her, cold, brilliant, unflinching. She thought about the storm, the crash, the calm in her voice that came only from having survived chaos before. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel it, pride. Not for herself, but for them. They'd faced the sky, and it had tried to break them. Instead, it made them stronger. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Today, they became soldiers. Not just because they followed orders, but because they believed in them." She closed the book, looked toward the hangar, and whispered, almost to herself. The laughter stopped, but something better started. 2 days after the storm, Charlie Squadron's hangar no longer smelled of sweat and oil. It reeked of disinfectant and tension. The plane, half dismantled and scorched from sand damage, sat silent in the corner like a wounded animal. The men had been ordered to rest, but no one really could. Not after what happened. And not after the message that came through early that morning. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, report to Command Review at 0900 regarding Incident Delta 7. The word spread across the base faster than any rumor. At 0900 sharp, Rebecca entered the review chamber. The room was small, stark, and cold. 3 officers at a raised desk, papers neatly stacked before them. Behind her, a lone chair faced the panel like a courtroom witness stand. She saluted crisply. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes reporting as ordered." The lead officer, Colonel Simmons, returned the salute with minimal enthusiasm. "At ease, Lieutenant Colonel." "Please be seated." Rebecca sat. Her expression was unreadable, calm, controlled, but with a flicker of steel behind her eyes. Simmons glanced down at his folder. "According to your report, during the training flight of October 12th, you deviated from assigned vector, engaged in unauthorized manual override, and conducted an emergency landing without prior clearance." Rebecca spoke evenly. "Yes, sir. All actions taken were necessary to preserve aircraft integrity and crew safety." Another officer, Major Torres, leaned forward. "The official telemetry shows that Engine 2 was operational at 40% power. Why didn't you attempt to return to base?" Rebecca met his gaze. "Because by the time I regained partial control, crosswinds made it impossible. Attempting to turn back would have resulted in total system failure." Torres raised an eyebrow. "That's your assessment." "That's my experience," she replied. The third officer, a stone-faced woman named Colonel Park, flipped the page. "And this manual override you performed, it's not listed in standard procedure. In fact, it's prohibited under current flight regulations." Rebecca didn't flinch. "With respect, Colonel, regulations can't account for chaos. Manuals don't save lives, decisions do." Simmons' expression hardened. "You took unauthorized action, risked government property, and endangered personnel." She spoke softly, but her words carried weight. "And those same personnel are alive because of those actions." The room went silent for a long moment. Finally, Simmons said, You'll remain on administrative hold pending further review. Rebecca nodded. Understood. When she exited the chamber, the hallway felt too bright. Her boots echoed against the polished floor, each step measured, deliberate. Outside, Miller and the squad were waiting. "Ma'am?" Miller asked. "What's happening?" "Routine procedure," she said shortly. "Command review after any unscheduled landing." Diaz frowned. "Doesn't sound routine. They treating you like a suspect?" Rebecca gave a faint, dry smile. In the military, survival always needs an explanation. Then she looked at them, really looked. The worry in their faces, the loyalty in their eyes. It almost broke her composure. "Get back to work," she said quietly. "That's an order." But none of them moved. For the next week, tension hung over the base like humidity before a storm. Rebecca was restricted from flight operations. Officially, it was standard protocol. Unofficially, it felt like exile. Still, she showed up every morning, same uniform, same routine, observing from the sidelines as others took over her drills. Miller hated it. So did Diaz. One afternoon, they were sitting in the hangar after drills when Diaz slammed his wrench on the table. "They can't do this to her. We'd be dead if she hadn't acted." Lewis looked up from his notes. "Command doesn't care about what we feel, Diaz. They care about rules." "Then the rules are broken," Miller said. The room went quiet. He stood, eyes hard. "I'm going to file a witness statement." "All of us should." Lewis sighed. "You'll just make it worse for her. You know how these reviews work. They'll call it emotional bias." "Then let them," Miller snapped. "I don't care." That evening, Miller found Rebecca in her office, reviewing maintenance logs as if nothing had changed. "Ma'am," he began. Without looking up, she said, "If this is about the hearing, drop it." He stepped forward. "No, ma'am. It's about truth. You saved us out there. If they're blaming you for doing your job," she raised a hand, stopping him. "Sergeant, sit down." He did. Rebecca closed the file and leaned back. Her expression was unreadable. "Do you know the first thing they teach in command school?" Miller frowned. "No, ma'am. That leadership isn't about being liked or even understood. It's about being responsible. Sometimes that means standing alone." "But it's not fair," he said. "Fairness," she replied quietly, "isn't in the soldier's contract." He hesitated. "Still, we can't just do nothing." Rebecca's eyes softened, barely. "You already did everything that mattered, Miller. You followed orders, you survived, and you proved you could lead when it counted. That's my job done." He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Understood, ma'am." But as he left, he knew she was lying, not to him, but to herself. 2 days later, the squad received notice. Rebecca Hayes, pending disciplinary review. Possible reassignment. The news hit like a gut punch. Diaz exploded first. Reassignment? After everything she did? Lewis rubbed his temples. They want to make an example. Keep everyone scared of improvisation. Miller stood silently and said, "Not if we speak." That night, he gathered the squad in the barracks and drafted a collective statement. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was factual. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes acted with full awareness of risk and in direct response to imminent system failure. Her decisions prevented loss of life. Every member of Charlie's squadron attests that without her command, the mission would have resulted in fatalities. Every man signed it. Miller printed the document and before dawn slipped it under the review board's office door. The following morning, Rebecca was summoned again. When she entered, the atmosphere was different. Simmons looked irritated, Torres unreadable, and Park just faintly intrigued. Simmons spoke first. We received a statement from your squad. Rebecca's brows lifted. Did you? Torres held up the paper. They claim your actions directly saved their lives. That without your intervention, the aircraft would have been lost. Rebecca kept her tone steady. They're correct. Park leaned forward. You didn't instruct them to do this? No, ma'am. Would you have? Rebecca paused, then said, No. Simmons exhaled through his nose. You understand that this kind of collective statement is irregular. I do, she said. But so was the storm. That earned the faintest smile from Park. After a long silence, Simmons closed the folder. Your command remains under review. But given the squadron's testimony, disciplinary action is suspended. You're to resume limited duties effective immediately. Rebecca saluted. Understood, sir. Outside the building, sunlight hit her face for the first time in days. The air felt warmer, realer. Her squad stood waiting, trying to act casual, but failing miserably. Diaz grinned. You're back, ma'am. Rebecca crossed her arms. I see word travels fast. Miller smirked. We might have helped it travel. She gave him a long, measured look. Then, finally, a quiet nod. Reckless, Sergeant. Yes, ma'am. Effective, she added. His grin widened. Also yes, ma'am. For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Mutual respect, hard-earned and real. That night, Rebecca sat at her desk, staring at her open notebook. Her pen hovered for a long time before she wrote. Sometimes silence protects. Other times, it condemns. Today, it spoke louder than orders. Then she closed the book and looked through the window at her team, laughing, working, alive. And though she wouldn't admit it, a small, genuine smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. For once, silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. The desert sun was relentless, blazing through the hangar windows and casting long shadows across the polished floors. For the first time in weeks, Charlie's squadron moved without tension clouding every action. Rebecca Hayes watched them quietly from her office, notebook closed, arms folded. The squad had changed. They were still rough around the edges, still loud when alone, still human. But now, they moved like a single organism, precise, alert, and united. Yet even amidst progress, she felt a storm inside herself, one that no drill, no emergency, no successful mission could calm. It started with the scar, a faint, silvery line running along her temple, usually hidden beneath her hair. For months, no one had asked about it. For weeks, she hadn't offered the story. But today, something compelled her to tell it. Not to boast, not to frighten, but to explain why she demanded perfection, discipline, and accountability, why she had no tolerance for foolishness. After the squad completed maintenance drills, she gathered them in a semicircle near the empty runway. Listen up, she said. Her voice, normally firm and clipped, carried a subtle softness. The squad straightened, sensing a rare seriousness in her tone. I want to tell you something, she began. Something personal. It explains why I lead the way I do, and why I expect what I expect. Diaz smirked nervously. This isn't going to be another one of your life lessons, ma'am, is it? Rebecca's eyes locked on him. It's a lesson, but not the one you think. It's a warning. And it's real. Miller leaned against the hood of a Humvee. Go on, ma'am. She inhaled, then exhaled slowly, as though the desert wind itself carried her memories away. Years ago, I was in command of a squadron not unlike this one. Young men, confident, strong, but inexperienced. We were on a mission overseas, training exercise, supposed to be routine. But it wasn't. Her voice faltered slightly. She glanced down at her hands before continuing. We were flying in formation when a mechanical failure occurred. One of my pilots ignored standard protocol, took a shortcut to save time. It cost him and 2 others their lives. A hush fell over the squad. The usual bravado drained from their expressions. I was there, Rebecca said, her eyes distant, watching it happen, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. Not then. Not ever. Diaz shifted uncomfortably. That's why I am like this, she interrupted softly. Why I don't allow shortcuts. Why I push you so hard. That scar on my temple? She tapped it lightly. It's from the crash. I survived because someone else made the mistake first. But the others didn't. And I swore I would never let that happen again. Not under my command. Silence hung over the runway, heavier than any storm they had flown through. Miller broke it first, his voice low. Ma'am, we never knew. We thought your rules were strict for strictness' sake. They were rules, she said quietly. But they're also shields. Against chaos. Against carelessness. Against death. Lewis finally spoke. So that's why you pushed us so hard in the drills. Even the midnight exercise. You wanted to make sure we'd survive if real danger came. Rebecca nodded. Exactly. I can't always protect you physically, but I can prepare your minds, your instincts, your reflexes. That's all a commander can do sometimes. Diaz swallowed, then muttered, No wonder you didn't flinch in the storm. In the real one. Because I've faced the worst already, she said. Her gaze softened. And I refuse to lose anyone else under my command. For the first time, the squad didn't see her as a strict officer, a boss, or a rule enforcer. They saw her as someone who had endured personal loss and pain, and had transformed that into strength they could rely on. Miller stepped closer. Ma'am, we get it now. Every push, every drill, every harsh word. It wasn't just discipline. It was survival. It was your way of making sure we don't end up like your old squad. Rebecca's lips curved faintly. Yes, and I want you to remember this. Respect isn't given automatically. It's earned through trust, action, and survival. And if you ever doubt me, remember this story. Diaz, who rarely stayed serious for long, broke the silence with a low, almost reverent chuckle. So you're saying, if we survive your next crazy drill, we earn our immortality? Rebecca's eyes twinkled with dry humor. Only temporarily. The next challenge comes soon enough. That evening, as the squad returned to the barracks, the dynamic had subtly shifted. Miller walked beside Diaz, quietly talking strategy instead of complaining. Lewis stayed behind for a moment, glancing at Rebecca's office before following. Rebecca watched from the doorway as her team disappeared into the barracks. Alone, she allowed herself a deep breath, the storm inside her finally settling, at least for now. She opened her notebook, pen poised, and wrote, The past shapes us. It haunts us, but it can also protect those we lead. Today, they understand why I push. Tomorrow, they might survive because of it. Her pen lingered over the page. Then she added, And perhaps, for the first time in years, I no longer feel the weight of it alone. The next morning, the squad gathered for routine inspections. The atmosphere was lighter, but not lax. Laughter returned in small doses, teasing, shared jokes, subtle camaraderie, but it carried a different weight now. It was not mockery, not defiance. It was trust. Miller caught her eye during the drill. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Rebecca returned it with a brief, approving glance. It was a silent exchange, a mutual understanding born of survival, hardship, and shared purpose. Even Diaz, usually restless, worked with focused intensity, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, only when he noticed Rebecca observing. Louis, ever analytical, watched quietly, absorbing every nuance. The squad had become more than a collection of individuals. They were cohesive. They were prepared. They were beginning to believe in her, and in themselves. Later, alone in her office, Rebecca touched her scar lightly. The memory of loss and fear never fully faded, but it no longer controlled her. She had faced the storm inside, just as she had led her squad through storms outside. For the first time, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the runway, carrying the echoes of laughter, drills, and the faint hum of jet engines. Change had come slowly. Hardly anyone noticed it immediately. But it was there, in the discipline of her men, in their quiet confidence, and in the subtle reverence that had replaced mockery. The storm inside her had settled, temporarily. But the storm ahead, she knew, would be just as challenging. And she would face it with them. The sun rose slowly over the desert, spilling gold and amber across the hangar. Charlie's squadron moved with a rhythm that was no longer forced or tense. It was natural, a reflection of the months of training, emergency drills, and lessons hard-learned under Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes. The hangar felt different that morning, not because of the light or the machinery, but because of the people inside it. Miller was polishing the nose of a jet with meticulous precision. Diaz was double-checking flight logs for errors, muttering to himself when he found a missing signature. Louis, quiet as always, observed both of them, scribbling notes on maintenance techniques, cross-referencing manuals. Rebecca stepped onto the hangar floor, boots clicking against the concrete. She paused, watching her squad. They were focused, precise, coordinated. But she noticed something she hadn't seen in weeks. Small smiles, subtle jokes shared quietly, glances of camaraderie. The laughter had returned. But it wasn't the careless, mocking kind of weeks ago. This was laughter earned through survival, trust, and shared experience. "Morning, ma'am," Miller said, not looking up, polishing a panel with deliberate care. "Morning," she replied. Her voice was calm, but beneath it lay something warmer than usual. Approval. Inspection completed yesterday. "No errors found," Diaz added, tapping his pen against the logbook. "All systems ready for flight?" Rebecca nodded. "Good work. All of you." The words were simple, but weighty. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was recognition of growth, effort, and resilience. "Squadron formation at 0900, she continued. "We have a guest from command, coming to observe the flight drills. Treat this as any other mission. Precision counts." The mention of command drew a collective breath. Months ago, the thought of inspection by higher-ups would have sparked panic. Today, it sparked focus. By 0900, the squadron was lined up on the runway. The jets gleamed under the morning sun, engines humming softly, ready to launch. The guest, Colonel Simmons, who had been critical in the post-storm review, observed from the control tower with a serious expression. Rebecca stood at the front of the formation, clipboard in hand. Her posture was perfect, but she didn't radiate the usual tension. She had prepared them for this day. They were ready, not just for her, not just for inspections, but for the challenges that would come in real combat. "Formation check," she called. Miller's voice rang out as he repeated the protocol, and the squad answered in unison. Step, response, synchronization, a symphony of discipline. Simmons raised an eyebrow. "Impressive," he muttered under his breath. The takeoff was flawless. Each pilot executed the pre-flight maneuvers perfectly. The jets lifted into the sky in a coordinated sweep, maintaining perfect distance, each maneuver precise and confident. Rebecca watched from the tower, noting small corrections, approving of adjustments. Halfway through the exercise, Rebecca saw it. the subtle way her squad communicated without words, anticipating one another's movements, covering for minor deviations before they became problems. Miller adjusted his throttle to compensate for wind drift. Diaz responded instinctively, aligning his position to Miller's correction. Lewis monitored instruments, signaling minor adjustments with hand gestures. Rebecca's lips curved in a subtle smile. They had internalized the lessons, the discipline, the focus, the survival instincts she had drilled into them. And now it was seamless. After an hour in the air, the squad completed a series of complex maneuvers, emergency simulations, and landing protocols. Each landing was precise, each checklist followed to the letter. When the last jet touched down, the hangar erupted, not with loud, careless laughter, but with the relieved, victorious smiles of a team that had become something greater than themselves. Simmons descended from the tower, walking toward the squad. He stopped in front of Rebecca. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he said, voice serious but carrying a trace of admiration. "I've seen many squads, many leaders, but this is exceptional. You've transformed them. They're ready for any mission." Rebecca inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, sir." "They earned it." Simmons nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And you earned their loyalty. I'll ensure command recognizes it formally. Your record will reflect the leadership that saved lives and built a team from what was once chaos." Later, as the sun dipped lower, painting the hangar in fiery hues, the squad gathered for debriefing. But it wasn't the usual tense review. This time, there were smiles, jokes exchanged quietly, and glances that carried understanding. Diaz nudged Miller. "I can't believe she actually let us breathe today." Miller chuckled. "Don't get used to it. But, yeah, feels good." Lewis added softly, "We finally get it. Every rule, every drill, every test, it all meant something." Rebecca watched them, heart quietly swelling. She could feel the shift, the difference between obedience out of fear and performance out of respect. They had grown not just as soldiers, but as a cohesive unit. That evening, as the squad settled into the barracks, Rebecca returned to her office. She opened her notebook and began to write. They laughed before, without care. They resisted, mocked, tested limits. I endured it, challenged it, broke them down to build them up. She paused, looking out the window at the desert twilight. The wind carried faint echoes of laughter from the barracks, softer, sincere, shared. Now they laugh because they have earned it, not out of defiance, but because they trust themselves, each other, and me. And that is worth every trial. She closed the notebook and leaned back, allowing herself a long, quiet breath. The squad had survived storms in the air and storms of command. They had learned discipline, focus, courage, and loyalty. And they had learned something else, that laughter could remain even in the midst of responsibility, challenge, and life or death stakes. The next morning, the squad walked across the runway together, boots in sync, ready for the next mission. They knew it wouldn't be easy. The military never promised easy. But they faced the day with confidence, skill, and unity. Rebecca walked slightly ahead, glancing over her shoulder. "Remember," she called softly, "discipline, focus, trust. And never forget why we do this." The squad responded instinctively, voices steady, synchronized. "Yes, ma'am." Miller smirked quietly at Diaz. "Think we'll ever see the hangar this calm again?" Diaz laughed softly. "Doesn't matter. We've earned the chaos we've conquered." Rebecca heard it all, smiled faintly, and kept walking. The laughter remained, tempered and genuine. The squad was no longer a band of careless jokers. They were professionals, bonded in ways only shared trials could forge. She paused for a moment, looking at the horizon where the sun rose over the desert. The laughter stopped when I arrived. But the laughter that remains now is earned, lasting, and stronger than fear. And for the first time in months, Rebecca Hayes allowed herself to feel completely at peace. Charlie's squadron had survived. They had grown. And their journey together, from ridicule and chaos to respect, skill, and unity, had reached a milestone that would endure long after this sunrise. The desert wind whispered softly around the hangar, carrying with it the sounds of machines, footsteps, and the faint, steady laughter of a team that had found both trust and triumph.